Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:08 p.m. in an extraordinarily Arctic Budapest. Really, the temperatures here have just sunk through the floor, and it's almost unbearable to be outside. And what's even more depressing is that I learned today that on March the 20, March the 9th, which is only about just over 2 weeks ago, in the United States, they are going to move their clocks forward. So they're going to have that extra hour of daylight that I would very much like to have. But here in Europe, the clocks don't move forward until March the 30th. So 3 weeks later. So we have to have an additional 3 weeks, have to be in misery here. While in the United States, they're basking in the extra hour of daylight when they can go out in the evening, they can play football, they can do all sorts of activities that they couldn't do in the winter because of the pitch black conditions. So that's that's the kind of the dismal news. Not till March the 30th here in Europe will we be able to enjoy a little bit more daylight. However, on a more upbeat note, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. It's time for our Thursday live stream. I mean, a couple of things, kind of housekeeping themes. Kash Patel has managed to get through 5149. I mean, the media sort of gleefully reporting it's 5149, but that's pretty good because you didn't need J.D. Vance's casting of the vote. And that means also that Trump has managed to get through. Coop W says, George, we had 40 yesterday. Today we got, I can't remember, 40 yesterday. That's really good. I like it when people still use Fahrenheit. I grew up with Fahrenheit, and I still have difficulties with Celsius. Everybody around me uses Celsius, but I grew up with Fahrenheit, and that's one that comes naturally to me. Just like meters and kilos do not come naturally to me. I as soon as somebody says something in meters, I have to do a rough calculation. Okay, how much is that in feet and inches? And say kilos. That's what in kilo. Well, what's how much is a pound? But anyway, so yeah, Kash Patel is through, and it also means that Trump has got all of his nominations through, all of his contentious nominations, and keep in mind that I actually thought he would have difficulties getting some of his contentious nominations through the Tulsi, Bobby Jr., I mean Kash Patel, obviously, and Pete Hegseth. He managed to get all of them through, so that's very. Kick 567 says, "Don't worry, George. When America sneezes, the world catches a cold. EU clocks will catch up." You're absolutely right. That's something we can talk about a little bit later on today. More and more, all the evidence suggests that this whole multipolarity thing is just been a giant con pulled by some well-meaning people, some not so well-meaning people, to fooling the world, understandably, that somehow There were many different poles in the world. In reality, unfortunately, we're still more or less where we were in the 1990s. Not quite as bad, but we haven't moved that far from that terrible time as we wanted to believe. We wanted to believe over the past 25, 30 years that those terrible unipolar days of the 1990s have gone, and now there's these many different poles in the world. Let a thousand flowers bloom, multipolarity. I'm afraid that's not on, but we can talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, so Trump has got all these people through, and I think that if there hadn't been this initial panic with Matt Gaetz, then I think Matt Gaetz could have probably got through. I think probably there was panic. Gaetz quit, and I don't know the exact circumstances as to why he quit. Whether Trump pulled the plug on him, Trump pushed him to quit, but nonetheless. He really didn't fight his corner. Nobody seemed to want to fight on his behalf. But in retrospect, I think if Gaetz had been willing to put up a fight, and if Trump had been willing to go into bat for Gaetz, I think Gaetz would have got through. Trump seems to be able to wield considerable power. I mean, he has it. I mean, he's clearly. He dominates the Republican Party. He dominates both houses, and he's not really losing that many supporters. So I think he would have got Matt Gaetz through. It's too bad for Gaetz. I rather liked him, but otherwise everyone is through, and the media are jumping up and down with excitement about a couple of polls suggesting that Trump is sinking in the polls. In reality, these polls are pretty good. I mean, he's got something like 45 to 47% support, which isn't that bad. But what's important, first of all, is that he doesn't need to worry too much about his poll ratings because he's not running for re-election. I mean, if he was thinking about re-election, Robert says there is a simple trick to convert centigrade to Fahrenheit. Multiply C by 2 and add 30, for example. Yeah, well, the trick is, and this is to do the conversion, is when it's Celsius, you multiply by 9/5, and you add 32. And if you want to, and if you get confused by that, then always remember that 50 degrees Celsius is 122 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's why if you multiply 50 by 9/5, you get 90. You add 32, it's 122. When you do it the other way, Fahrenheit to Celsius, you first subtract the 32, and then you multiply by 5/9. I learned this at school. So again, 122 minus 32, that gets you to 90. 90 times 5/9 gets you to 50. So that's the that's a quick way of doing it. But the one with the meters is a little harder, and even the kilos and pounds are a little harder. Because roughly I think, okay, well, 2 pounds to 1 kilo, but that's not quite correct. So you could, if you keep doing this, you're going to start, your numbers start going way off. If you want to know how much this way, if you just multiply it by 2, that wouldn't quite be the right answer. But anyway, that's fascinating digressions. I don't know. My Rumble account says 2.2 pounds. Oh, a kilo is 2.2 pounds. Is that right? Okay. I mean, I know that it's something like 450 grams is 1 pound. I think 450 grams is 1 pound. So £2 would be 900 grams. So 2 pounds would be 0.9 kilos. So I think that's roughly what it is. But it's still you have to be kind of do the do the numbers right. Yeah, 454. My Rumble says 454 grams is 1 pound. Yeah. So yeah. But these polls. So the polls are suggesting that Trump is is slipping in the polls, and of course there's gleefulness in the media. I was watching CNN today, and they're all celebrating. Oh, whoa! These poll numbers are terrible for Trump, and then now the Democrats feel energized. Oh, we can take on Trump. We're going to take him on. Um, and now so we're now feeling confident. We were beaten over the head and got a terrible thrashing in November, but now we're challenging Trump in the courts, and we're feeling confident and enthusiastic and energetic. Well, as I say, Trump doesn't have to run for re-election, he can't run for re-election. So therefore, these poll numbers really don't mean a great deal. The thing is that what they're trying to do is challenge him in the courts. I think they're going to have mixed successes. I think they're obviously doing this whole strategic forum shopping, challenging him in districts where they're likely to get favorable rulings, and then that's appealed to the appellate courts, and then many of these appellate courts are likely to rule against Trump, and then it goes up to the Supreme Court. I don't think that many of these Democrats and all the Democrat-aligned groups will be particularly successful at the Supreme Court, because from what I can see, Trump is really exercising the powers that he has as president. I mean, those are the powers that are articulated in the second Article 2 of the Constitution, and you can't just have judges. It's ridiculous. You can't have judges second guessing presidents. I mean, that's just it's an absurdity. I mean, the judiciary is an independent branch of the government, but you can't just simply say, well, the president can't fire this person, the president can't fire that person, he can't close down this agency. Well, of course he can. I mean, that's the president is not just simply a rubber stamp for Congress. The problem, of course, from Trump's point of view, is that this is dragging things out, because this is going to go on into the courts and the hearings, and then each of these cases will kind of wind their way to the Supreme Court, and that's all going to take months and months, and then you have to wait months and months until the Supreme Court issues its ruling. So Trump loses momentum as this goes on, and again, we're obviously only had 1 month of the Trump presidency, but it's going to be a relatively short presidency, because we have the midterms, and it's always a tricky one to hold on. I think to hold on to the House. I mean, the Republicans only have a very narrow margin in the House. So that's obviously going to be a challenge holding on to that. And then, of course, after the midterms, the presidential election for 2028 starts up, because then we'll have the obviously the Democrat battle is going to begin. They're all going to throw in their hats into the ring. All sorts of absolutely unknown, obscure nonentities will emerge out of the woodwork, saying that I'm seeking the presidency for 2028. But then, of course, you also have the the Republican field, because that, I mean, I'm trying to, um, because as far as I can see, if you just think about the Republican field, it's relatively open. There's going to be no front runner, no obvious front runner. I mean, I mean, J.D. Vance is a front runner, um, but it's by no means a done deal, because there are, political heavyweights within the Republican Party who may well be seeking the nomination for 2028, and they're not going to cede any ground to J.D. Vance. I mean, if you think of Josh Hawley, I mean, he's been around now for longer. In fact, he was a kind of a populist nationalist um, before Vance. So there will be people who will immediately uh, be presenting themselves. I mean, I'm trying to think what happens when you have a president in his second term, and there is a contest to succeed him. Um, it was with Ronald Reagan. I mean, George W. Bush had the inside track, but not wholly, because he was challenged by Bob Dole, but that wasn't too big of a challenge. I mean, in the end, Dole kind of imploded, and Bush really romped home for an easy win for the nomination. And then with Bill Clinton, there was Al Gore. Obviously, had the inside track, and then he was um, uh, Buchanan. Somebody mentions Buchanan. Buchanan didn't run in 1988. Buchanan ran in 1992, and he challenged Bush, but Bush was seeking re-election. I'm speaking about what happens when you have a president who's completing his second term, and therefore he can't run. And then what happens in the nomination fight within the party? Buchanan in '88, it was quite interesting, because um, he was urged to run. I mean, no question, he was urged to run, and and then he said he wasn't going to run. But the reason he said he wasn't going to run was that he was making way for Jack Kemp, which itself was very interesting, because Jack Kemp really wasn't the kind of conservative that Buchanan was, because Jack Kemp was a supply sider, a tax cut nut. And then, as it turned out, he became this one of these enterprise zones, giving it minorities and so on. That's the kind of thing that really it does not go down well within the Republican Party. We have these kind of giving capital to minorities to set up businesses. People think, hey, you're just pissing away public money, so that's not popular. So Jack Kemp really failed massively, but he failed massively. I mean, thanks for reminding me, because I kind of remember '88 as being this fight between Bush and Dole, and then I'd forgotten that the reason why it was a two-man race between Bush and Dole was that Jack Kemp was elbowed out very, very quickly. I mean, he was a really lousy candidate. There were other, really lousy candidates, because again, for some reason, Alexander Haig, the former U.S. Secretary of State, the former number two to Henry Kissinger at Nixon's National Security Council, he decided to run, and there was never really, again, no obvious reason why he did so, because he was essentially very much a mainstream Republican foreign policy guy, the usual kind of interventionist, taking on, the Soviets. Well, still, the Soviets were still around in those days. Yeah, getting tough with the Soviets. But his problem was that he hadn't been a very successful Secretary of State. He got this big job from Reagan, and because he had this pedigree. I mean, he'd been, as I say, number two to Kissinger. He was then White House chief of staff to Nixon. Did in Nixon, of course. That's a given. He betrayed Nixon, but that's what you would expect. But he was promoted for it, and then became chairman. I can't remember whether he was ever chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I know he became Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and then he got that job as Secretary of State. But if you recall, it was an absolute disaster because it was he who, unbeknownst to Reagan, plotted with Menachem Begin the whole Lebanon invasion. I mean, it was an absolutely disastrous invasion, but there's no question he was involved in the planning of that invasion. And Reagan obviously wasn't too happy about that. I mean, people recall. Oh yeah. What about that? His famous news conference in the White House after Reagan was shot, and when he said, I'm in charge here, and which of course went down really badly when he declared that he was in charge. He's not in charge of anything. But that wasn't really what sank him. And people always want to say, "Oh, that's what sank Haig." It was the invasion of Lebanon, and you really can't do these things, major acts of policy, behind the back of the president, and that's what Haig did. And so he was gone. But no one really thought that he would have the goal to run in '88. But anyway, of course, his candidacy went nowhere, and Jack Kemp's candidacy went nowhere. So Pat Buchanan, he wouldn't have won the nomination. So Pat Buchanan, who made the way for Jack Kemp, kind of was needn't have done so. And as I say, after New Hampshire, because Bush won that comfortably, and from then on, it was just easy sailing for Bush. But the next one, where it happened within the party of an incumbent who couldn't run for a third term, was, of course, with Bill Clinton in the year 2000. And there, Al Gore obviously was, he had the inside track, and everyone assumed it would be Al Gore. But as is the media's wont, they try to puff up these races. That there's something a really exciting race. There's something a really dramatic contest. And so his main challenger was this character that everyone, I'm sure, has now forgotten, Bill Bradley, who was this very tall guy who had played basketball for the Knicks, and he was the sort of the great white hope in the 1980s, because the neocons latched onto him. He wasn't too bright. The neocons always battened onto politicians who really were not very bright. Dan Quayle, Colin Powell, John McCain. You could sort of go through the list of all the figures that the neocons wanted to use as their figurehead. But Bill Bradley was seen as the new Democrat, because in the 80s he had supported as a Democrat, he had supported Reagan's wars in Central America, and he'd voted for funding for the Contras, and that of course made him a hero to the neocons, and you know, automatically, having not done anything, having definitely, a man who definitely had no charisma at all. I mean, he was just tall, he was a tall guy. He had no charisma at all, and but he was already talked about as as a serious candidate for 88. But he didn't do it. He didn't run in 88. I'm not sure why he didn't run in 88, but he didn't do it. Mario Cuomo was also expected to run in 88, but he didn't do it. Um, and the nominee, the Democratic nominee in 88, I'm sure everyone has already forgotten who was the Democratic nominee in 1988, because again, he was an eminently forgettable figure, the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. And but anyway, so for some reason, um, Bill Bradley, decided that he was going to make a make a pitch in 2000, and of course he didn't seriously challenge Gore. It was again a very easy, straightforward win. There was no real contest. So Gore got through. And then of course the next time, when there was an incumbent and there was a race for the nomination, incumbent who couldn't run for a third term, was of course in 2016, when Obama couldn't run for the third term, and so there was a contest of sorts between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Now, I guess I have to be in a minority of one. I never thought highly of Bernie Sanders at all. And I never bought into any of the nonsense that the people were saying. Bernie. I may not be a man of the left, but boy, Bernie, he's a real, he's a real formidable political figure. He's a real, he believes in what he says. He's a real, man of the people. He's a real tapping into nationalist populist sentiment. It was so utterly nonsensical. Anybody could have known from the start that he wasn't going to run a serious campaign. The whole purpose of his campaign, as it was in 2020, was to shepherd in the left of the party to support the mainstream Democrat who was going to get the nomination. He did that, and he never really made any serious challenge. And his campaign was stupid. I mean, you can't. Any bloody fool can run a campaign and saying X percent of the people own Y percent of the economy. I mean, you can do this, till the cows come home. It doesn't mean anything. As most of these economic statistics by themselves don't mean a great deal. But nonetheless, he played with that, but never really had an answer to the problem, which was, well, how do you get your economy to produce? I mean, I know, you want to redistribute the wealth. Oh, that's understandable. I mean, you want to, everyone to have universal health care. You want everyone to have a guaranteed income, whatever, $15 an hour minimum wage. I mean, all these fantastic things. Any bloody fool can say, I want all these great things, and that's what I'm going to deliver. But he couldn't really answer. Yeah, but how are you going to ensure that the economy will produce? Because that's the key. I mean, you can redistribute, but ultimately, if you're not producing anything, then there's nothing to redistribute. So he couldn't really answer that question, and in the end, I think people realized that he couldn't answer that question, and then, given where the party was on the question of immigration, he wanted no control on immigration. Well, that makes it very difficult, because if you're promising all kinds of goodies for for everyone, um, well, how are you going to stop the whole world coming in and saying, "Yeah, I'd like my free healthcare, I'd like my free education, and I'd like some free housing, please, and I'd like to have a guaranteed income. Is that all right?" Um, I mean, it was again a very obvious question that he couldn't answer. So, but anyway, the long and short of it is that there was never really any major contest in each of these cases. Somebody won it very easily, and that was that. So maybe I'd say, it may be that JD Vance will romp home comfortably in 2028, and that Josh Hawley, Vance isn't exactly a charismatic figure either. I mean, neither of them. I mean, they're both pretty good as debaters. They're both pretty good as interview subjects. They handle reporters well, but neither is is particularly charismatic. I mean, it's going to be it's going to be a letdown after Trump. I mean, it's just going to be a letdown. People suddenly are realizing, wow, what's life going to be like without Trump? There was some of that in 1988 with Ronald Reagan. That people had become so fond of Reagan that whoever came after him was always going to be a disappointment. It's I think it was Mark Shields, that political commentator. When I used to watch those Shields and Gergen, I think on the McNeil era NewsHour, they'd have these summary of the week's developments from Shields and Gergen. But I remember when they were covering the '88 race, he's saying that, well, George Bush coming after Reagan is a little like John Wayne is leaving town and Jimmy Stewart is taking over. That's just it's a disappointment. Just basically, you can't replace John Wayne, and you definitely can't replace him with Jimmy Stewart. So yeah. Anyway, there's that. But it is the case, and I think if you listen to and I strongly urge everyone to listen to the podcast that we did with Jeff Shepard yesterday, the great Nixon specialist. He did say that Trump is going to have that problem that Nixon had, which was that Nixon was a lame duck. I mean, once he was reelected, he was a lame duck, and once you're a lame duck, people are not going to be afraid of you. They know that that's it. You're done. I mean, they voted for his cabinet picks. Yeah, they said, okay, well, he's entitled to get the team that he wants. But after a while, they say, well, his term is coming to an end. I mean, it's just the administration is daily dying, because as it moves towards its inevitable denouement. So after a while, he's going to start losing supporters within the GOP. They're saying, well, I'm not really afraid of him anymore. He's going to be gone. Yeah, that might happen. I don't know if people saw or people have watched the discussion that we had with Jeff Shepard, which I think it's very, very interesting comparing Nixon with Trump, because there are similar figures, with the exception of Trump obviously having much greater charisma than Nixon ever had, and of course Trump having money. Nixon really never had any money. I mean, he came from a very, very poor home. I don't think there's ever been a president who in U.S. history who ever came from a humbler background than Nixon did. So he never really had money, which was a difficult situation for him. And again, a difference was obviously Nixon was an intellectual. I mean, he read books, he thought about things, and so it's a different personalities, but they both aroused enormous antipathy, huge antipathy. And in the Nixon case, it was very, very interesting because, in terms of his politics, in terms of his views on the world, his domestic policy, his foreign policy, they were pretty mainstream. I kind of challenged Shepard. If you watch it, you'll see it. I challenged him on the issue of busing, and I don't think Shepard really answered my point that the Nixon Justice Department was pursuing busing and enforced school integration. That was the Nixon Justice Department. And he says, yeah, well, that was because of the courts. Well, yeah, that was the courts, but nonetheless, the Nixon Justice Department pursued this with considerable zeal. And in fact, Shepard admitted that one of the great successes of the Nixon administration was the enforced school integration, at least in the public schools, the school integration in the South. So there's no question that what they were doing. Again, what was true was that Nixon campaigned against busing. So Nixon, had it both ways. I mean, his Justice Department pursued this busing, a very, very unpopular policy, but somehow he managed to distance himself from it by campaigning against busing, as if somehow it's the liberals who were insisting on this extremely horrible, hated policy of busing. But that was Nixon's great political skill. That he managed to have both ways. But ultimately, he was very again domestic issues. Very, it was very much within the liberalism of that time. Setting up the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, setting up the EPA, and all this Consumer Protection Board. I mean, all these agencies that were set up under Nixon, and then again, I made the point to Shepard that that it wasn't just enforced integration in schools that the Nixon Justice Department pushed, but it was also enforced housing integration, which is why Trump's father, Fred Trump, was constantly in trouble with the Nixon Justice Department. The Nixon Justice was continually filing suit against him that he was basically not allowing blacks to live in Trump Village, middle class housing, which is very, very nice houses where people really paid attention to how their houses look, their gardens, flowers and everything else. This is the way middle class people generally pay a lot of attention to their homes. They want to live in nice neighborhoods and pay attention. Then home neighborhoods need to be clean and tidy, and where children can play and without fear and so on. And the price for that, obviously, is, well, they didn't want to have blacks moving in. Because if blacks move in, they're afraid that suddenly it's not going to be so nice anymore. And it was constantly being being subject to these suits from the Nixon Justice Department. And then they would sign some kind of a whatever those I've forgotten what those things are called. When you sign an agreement with the Justice Department, you promise that you will do this, this, and this, and then they'll come back, I don't know, whatever, in 6 months' time, and see whether you've actually done this, this, and this. There's a term for it. It slipped my mind. And then he would sign these things with the Justice Department, and then they would come back after 6 months and said, "No, you haven't done those things. You still essentially it's a de facto segregation. You're still not allowing blacks to move in." So I think that was the reason why Trump Jr. Decided to abandon that. He didn't want to do the middle class housing thing, didn't want to do Queens anymore, and decided to move to Manhattan and build luxury homes. And because once you build luxury homes, you don't really have the problem of somehow, that you don't have enough blacks here, because you say, well, I don't care what color skin you are, you gotta come up with the money, you gotta pay the rent. And that's what he did. But the thing was that, just going back to Nixon, that this was really the product of a deep snobbery. I mean, this was real snobbish hatred for him. I knew this guy, very waspy guy. He used to work at the CIA. And as people who used to work at the CIA won't, he's very waspy, a little classic wasp, like talking that waspy way, barking things out. Anyway, and this was really many years after Watergate and everything else, and he would still sneeringly talk about how Nixon would button his jacket, and then when he would do the double victory sign, he would look so ridiculous. And he would still talk about how in political ads, when he's walking on the beach, he'd be walking on the beach with his wearing his dress shoes, which who walks on the beach wearing dress shoes? So, but there was always that snobbish aspect to the contempt that in which von Nixon held. And I remember, when I was living in London at the time, and the British journalists are just scum. I mean, they always have been scum. They're probably even scummier now than they were then, but even then they were pretty scummy. And so naturally, in the coverage of Watergate, the British journalists who would, they would have these TV shows, what happened to the Watergate hearings today? Ooh. John Mitchell said this, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway. And then that if Nixon gave a speech, a national televised address, then there would be a panel, all English journalists, and they would invite on somebody like Arthur Schlesinger. So again, the British, they didn't know. They wouldn't know why. They just say, well, Arthur Schlesinger, he's is a professor of American history. Whatever. They say, yeah, but he's a Kennedy partisan. He worked for Kennedy. I mean, he wrote a hagiographic book about Kennedy. I mean, what do you expect him? Of course, he's going to denounce Nixon. I mean, but they counted on the British being stupid and ignorant about these things. But anyway, yeah, they bring him on, and Schlesinger on, and some guy at the Washington Post and whatever. This is what they did. Well, what was the name of the guy? Anthony Lewis. Yeah, Anthony Lewis used to have this column in the New York Times. They were really tedious character. Anyway, they bring him on and so on. And then after Nixon had given this televised address during Watergate, this English journalist, who was actually quite a nice guy. I mean, I don't want to tell his name. He was actually quite a nice guy. But nonetheless, he subscribed to all the liberal cliches about Nixon. But more than that, the liberal cliches that were coming from America. You see, these English journalists had simply made their own, absorbed as their own the cliches spouted by American journalists. So after this address, this English journalist says, "Well, this reminds me of what Jack Kennedy said about Nixon after his 1962 debacle, when Nixon lost his campaign for governor of California." And Jack Kennedy said, apparently he really did say it, Nixon, went out the same way he came in, no class. And this English journalist thought this was really, really funny. This is really, really clever. That you have Jack Kennedy, son of a bootlegger, Harvard and whatever, all this money coming in, bootlegging money. And then saying this, this supposedly America, classless, egalitarian society. And it says he went out the same way he came in, no class. And again, it just shows how these things are just absorbed, and then it becomes just second nature. And if again, I'm just recalling my time in England, where again the hatred for Nixon among the English journalists was quite striking, because they simply had absorbed all of the nonsense from American journalists. They didn't have any ideas of their own. They just simply, well, what's Anthony Lewis saying? Or what's the New York Times saying? What's CBS saying? What's the Washington Post? And they just repeat it. Because if you're an English journalist, there's no reason whatsoever why you should dislike Nixon. Because Nixon, as far as the British were concerned, was actually a very good president. He was very respectful, very helpful. He was, whoever was prime minister, whether it was Harold Wilson or whether it was Edward Heath, he always cultivated good relations with them. And generally, he was very, very considerate about the European opinions. He didn't have any of the the high-handed approach of other presidents. But they just simply repeated what the Americans said. So in the case of Nixon, a lot of this was not ideological. It was driven by a kind of a class hatred. That again, that he came from a very, very humble, a low class background, and this worked against Johnson as well. He was seen as a usurper. They were all in love with Kennedy, and he was seen as a usurper because he was sitting in Kennedy's throne. Now, if you go back, if you then go forward a few years into the Trump era, the Trump is much more of an ideological case, because by now, and this happened really after Nixon, there was a considerable movement, a kind of ideological conservatism, which really obviously there'd been ideological conservatism in the Nixon era, particularly from Barry Goldwater, but it had failed. Goldwater was a terrible candidate. He'd been humiliated in '64. So there wasn't really any market for ideological conservatism. But gradually over the years, even this ideological conservatism grew stronger and stronger, and then it became a real movement. Now, Trump himself was kind of a pragmatist. I mean, if you compare Trump with Nixon, you say, well, they're pretty much the same. They don't Trump doesn't have too many strong views on things. He's been this, he's been that. Um, he's been friends with all sorts of people. He's been friends with Democrats. He's been friends with Republicans. But once he decided in 2015 to seek the Republican nomination, he had to take conservatism seriously. He then gave it a twist, which was he adopted a kind of a populist economics, which up until then hadn't really been a staple of republicanism. Republicans had just basically said, well, we want free trade, budgetary discipline, budget, orthodoxy, must have balanced budgets, and of course tax cuts. And at various times, they brought up entitlement reform, absolute election killer. We're going to cut your pensions. Fantastic. So that was republicanism. So he kind of moved away from all of that, adopted this populist economics with tariffs, and very immigration control, which of course would tighten labor markets. But he abandoned the big Republican orthodoxy, which was balanced budgets. He had no interest at all in balancing budgets. He had no interest at all really in curtailing government spending. I mean, even today, you kind of get the sense that when he's doing this whole Doge thing, he's firing employees, he's slashing government programs. It's not so much that he's trying to save money. I think he's trying to dismantle the administrative state. He's trying to dismantle the very state that is obviously opposed to him, and it's very much his enemy. And that definitely dovetails with Nixon. And Nixon came into office in 1969, and he knew that this government, the people who are in the government, they're all there from the FDR era, they're there from the Truman era, they were there during the Kennedy and Johnson era. Eisenhower was just simply a placeholder for a few years, but basically it was the same government, and that they were absolutely going to resist him. And he tried to get around it. He tried to build his own team to ensure that he would get his agenda through. And I think what Jeff Shepard said yesterday was quite interesting. He said that, well, when he came to domestic affairs, I think Nixon just realized that there was nothing he could do. I mean, this government was just too strong, too powerful, and there was no point in even trying to bring that under any kind of presidential control. But when he came to foreign affairs, he actually could get around the government, and there he had Kissinger, and he just simply went around all of the governmental agencies. He went around the State Department. He went around the Pentagon, and they really did. Well, they were angry with him because he really didn't keep them at all in the loop. And then you had the sort of the Moore Radford spying ring. Again, people have probably forgotten about that. They were just basically, this was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Moore, was spying. He had this guy in the White House, Radford, in the White House, basically spying on the president, trying to get, trying to find out what Nixon's plan was in arms control. So that was then so there you have the real parallels with between Nixon and Trump. But Nixon was really brought down by the government. The government in the end. He made mistakes, and they pounced. You don't make mistakes. If you make a mistake, they will pounce. Um, but I think one thing that I wanted to, we didn't really have time. What I wanted to um, elicit from Jeff Shepard, because he attempted to answer the question that well, what would Trump yeah, Esse Dillendam says the Mora Radford affair, 1970. Yeah, 1970. That's right. But again, now almost completely forgotten. No one. But that was again an early version of the deep state, an early version of Alexander Vindman trying to bring down Trump. But well, the question was, what would Trump think of Nixon? And he said, well, Trump has mixed feelings about Nixon, and he said that Trump thinks that Nixon shouldn't have resigned. Which I don't know whether Trump said that. Maybe Trump did say that somewhere. But I always thought that's an interesting take. Whether whether it would have been wise for Nixon to attempt to fight his impeachment in the Senate. I mean, obviously, the House would have impeached Nixon. There was no question about that. The Democrats had an overwhelming majority; they would have impeached him. But then the question is whether he could get 34 senators and survive a trial. Now, Goldwater, a treacherous, horrible little man he was, said to him, "No, you're done. You're going to get about 2 votes in the Senate." I don't know whether that's the case or not, but that was what Goldwater wanted, to see Nixon out. He wanted to humiliate Nixon. Again, it's very, very, very strange why Goldwater hated Nixon so much. Nixon had actually been rather good to him. So they told him, no, you're done. You can't hope to win. I don't know whether that's the case. Whether he could have put up a solid defense. I certainly wasn't impressed with any of the lawyers around Nixon. They didn't seem to make the case as they should have done that he's the president. It's he as president is absolutely entitled to make proper decisions when it comes to his own these official acts of the president. When it comes to national security, when it comes to Justice Department, he is the chief magistrate, he's the chief executive, and he's the commander in chief. So all of those decisions are his, and the Congress cannot second guess him. When it comes to these things. I think that's what he. So somebody says here, Tom, I like Goldwater. I disagree with you. I think Goldwater was a terrible, terrible person. He was a terrible candidate. And then he spent years and years in the Senate after that, just being a curmudgeon, just they do nothing other than just growling and about I think filled with bitterness about what happened to him in '64, and so he was just I mean, really, in the end, he really wasn't much of a conservative at all. He was supposed to always Mr. Conservative, but he was really not much of a conservative at all. Hated Reagan, didn't do anything to support Reagan, and then again, Nixon, who had campaigned for him in '64, the one prominent Republican figure who had campaigned for him in '64, he hated. Again, just was waited for his opportunity to do Nixon in. So I mean, that's that. Whether he did, I mean, of course, we've always wondered what would have happened had he destroyed the tapes. They were his tapes. They're presidential papers. This was all before the Presidential Records Act and anything else. So at that time, no one really questioned that the president is entirely responsible for his own records. He can do what he likes with his records. He can burn them, he can take them wherever you like, and wherever he like, whatever. I mean, no one questioned that. So he could have absolutely done that, burnt the tapes, and then leave it up to Congress. I mean, yeah, they would have impeached him, but I think he would have survived the trial. I mean, that I think for destroying his own records. So I thought that was interesting. Why he didn't destroy his records, whether he could have decided to stand and fight for in the trial in the Senate. As I say, I was so unimpressed with his lawyers that I'm not sure that those lawyers would have won their argument just because they're such lousy lawyers. Um, and then of course there's the other question whether whether he allowed the various people to stay on for far too long instead of firing them earlier on. But I mean, that's always risky when you start firing people, that they're going to turn on you and try to, which is what happened. That they're going to turn on you and try to implicate you in whatever they did. But I think that the big difference is that you really had, at that time, the sort of political media culture was so dominated by the regnant liberalism that there was almost no serious opposition. I mean, that's why those lawyers were just so Nixon's lawyers were just so lousy. They didn't seem to make any kind of a convincing argument. I think now, you would have had a much stronger legal team who would have actually gone in and put up a strong defense, which I think he didn't have then. And they would now. I think it's a different time. I think it works much more to Trump's advantage, and I think it demonstrates just how isolated Nixon was. How almost in every way Nixon's isolation was really sad. It was also interesting that it was one of the only times, I don't know, recent U.S. history, and maybe somebody might come point out that there was some other time when there wasn't any living ex-president. So Nixon was at the height of Watergate. There wasn't a single living ex-president. Johnson had died in 1973. Harry Truman had died in 1973. Eisenhower, I think, had died in 1969. Kennedy had obviously was assassinated in 1963. So there was no one at all. I think of Hoover. I think he died in 1964. So he really was quite isolated. I mean, I don't think it would have made much of a difference, whether there was an ex-president, because I'm sure if he was a Democrat, he wouldn't have given him any support. And then if he was a Republican, they would have probably thought about, well, what's Nixon ever done for me? What do I care about him? I mean, Eisenhower notoriously didn't do anything to help Nixon out, when famously during the Chequers crisis, when he was alleged to be have created or that rich donors had created a slush fund for him because he was poor. I mean, so they knew he needed money, so these donors had created a slush fund, and that's when he had to do his famous Chequers speech. And Eisenhower did absolutely nothing to support him. Nothing. He just washed his hands of it. Hey, you're on your own. And it really did look like Nixon was done. He wasn't going to survive this crisis, and until he made his Chequers speech, which really stirred the country, because he was a poor boy, and people I think identified with him. Hey, he's just like us. He's poor. He's trying to make his way in the world. People are out to do him in. And when he said, "Well, there's my wife," nice, very ordinary um, housewife-looking woman, and she's wearing a cloth coat. She's not wearing a mink coat. She's wearing a cloth coat. Um, so, um, so that anyway, that's the um, uh, what is it? Kick 577. Goldwater carried 6 states. Goldwater didn't carry 6 states. I think Goldwater carried 4 states. Maybe he carried 5 states, but I'm pretty sure he carried 4 states. But I think what was interesting was that Goldwater carried the states in the Deep South. And why it was interesting, because that presaged the huge political realignment that was to come in America in the 1960s and 70s, because the deep state was the Democratic Party's stronghold. And so he carried 4 states, maybe 5 states, I think 4 states. And then George Wallace carried 5 states in 68. Wallace was, of course, a Democrat, but he ran as an independent in the general election. But that was the major realignment, and really ever since then, except for the briefly Jimmy Carter in '76, and to a certain limited extent with Bill Clinton, the South has been Republican stronghold. So I mean, so much so that even Al Gore in 2000 against George W. Bush, I'm pretty sure, maybe I don't remember this well enough, but I'm pretty sure that in 2000, Al Gore did not carry his own home state of Tennessee. But anyway, the other big news is the ongoing crisis between Trump and Zelensky, and this war of words is now intensifying, and which is rather nice, and really he's getting Zelensky is getting whacked over the head, not just by Trump. Yeah, my Rumble account says he didn't win Tennessee, Bush did. Yeah, that's how I remembered it. I mean, which itself was very interesting, because it was a close election. I mean, remember, it was all settled in Florida. Everything hung on Florida, so it wasn't like, oh, it was a blowout, and therefore he didn't carry his home state. But I mean, so this was a close election, and even so, Al Gore did not carry his home state. And remember, Tennessee was really owned by the Gore family, because his dad had been a senator for Tennessee. So it's like, he had inherited the Senate seat from his father. Anyway, so going back to Zelensky, it's a kind of an interesting situation, because now Vance has joined in with these attacks, and then apparently he there was a meeting today with Keith Kellogg, and the news conference that was supposed to take afterwards was canceled. And so it's clearly escalating. But as I've been saying, and I can repeat myself, but that this only works to Russia's advantage if Russia now makes nice with America, which means that Putin has to indicate to Trump that he intends to bring this war to an end, and that means bring this war to an end before he achieves Russia's wartime goals. Because at the moment, in Trump's view, which is, I think, different from his view, I think, 2 weeks ago. In Trump's view, the Russians are ready to talk, the Russians are ready to compromise, and Zelensky isn't. So that's the key there. Now, you know, you now have this sort of situation. You can either have, I mean, which is Trump's idea. Russia is willing to compromise and negotiate. Ukraine's willing to compromise and negotiate. So that's obviously that's the ideal for Trump. What are the other alternatives? Well, the other alternative, Ukraine is willing to compromise and negotiate, and Russia isn't. In which case, Trump then escalates against Russia. Trump argues that Russia is standing in the way, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians, they're on the side of good. They want to bring this war to an end, and that Putin, what they're saying is absolutely right. Putin and the Russians are absolutely unwilling to compromise, unbending, and it's just as the media keep repeating, Russia is not willing to compromise, even though what they mean is Russia's not willing to capitulate. That's what they mean. So, it doesn't. There's no indication Russia is willing to negotiate. So that's that. But that now is a little bit difficult. So in other words, Ukraine's willing to compromise and negotiate, and Russia isn't. Or you could have it the other way around, which is Russia is willing to compromise and negotiate, and then Ukraine isn't, which is how Trump is seeing it now, in which case, Trump vents his fury at Ukraine. That again works to Russia's advantage only as if the Russians then indicate that they are willing indeed to make compromises, which means compromise means you're not going to achieve your wartime goals. You're not going to bring the 4 oblasts under your control. You're not going to take Odessa, which means you're not going to create the land bridge to Transnistria, which was, the Russians hadn't really spelled that out as one of their wartime goals, but common sense would suggest that Transnistria is a real problem for Russia, because if Moldova or NATO or Ukraine at some point decide to attack Transnistria, there's really not much Russia can do about it, because it has no land border with Moldova. It has no land border whereby it can do anything for Transnistria. That's why it was always important to take Odessa, so that would create the land bridge to Transnistria. So that's not going to happen. And then finally, of course, there's the most likely option, which is, well, neither Russia nor Ukraine is willing to compromise and negotiate. And I don't know what Trump would do in those circumstances. Whom would he blame? Would he then abandon Ukraine altogether, lose interest in the whole thing? But at the moment, Russia's kind of basking in Trump's favor, because Trump has now seen, hey, Ukraine is not willing to negotiate, Ukraine's not willing to compromise, Russia is. But that can only last so long, because in the first place, it could be that some people, some smarter people are going to get around Zelensky. They're going to go see Zelensky and say, look, you're not handling Trump properly. You don't want to get yourself into a shouting match with Trump. Trump really doesn't like that. So you need to get on Trump's wavelength. You got to show that you're willing to compromise. And show that you're willing to make concessions. So that could certainly happen. In fact, I do think that will happen. I think that Zelensky is going to have to change his tune, because at the moment he's really pissing Trump off, and that's not really doing him any good. Then, so if that happens, and if they say, okay, right, well, we're ready, we're ready to negotiate and compromise. Well, then what does Russia do? If Russia said, well, we don't really want, we want to go on fighting, we want to achieve our objectives, our wartime objectives, well, then you've got Trump, who's then going to vent his fury at Russia, and then he would escalate against Russia. And so that's there's a real dilemma. I'm not buying, for 1 minute, the theory that Russia is just going to continue this war and until we achieve all our wartime objectives. That would make sense. I mean, if they were going to do that, that would only make sense if Ukraine was on the brink of collapse, which I don't think it is. Maybe I'm wrong, but we've been hearing about Ukraine's on the brink of collapse for a long time, but it doesn't look like it's on the brink of collapse. Or Trump is going to pull the plug. Now, if Russia maintains its offensive, in other words, if it continues maintaining its offensive, and particularly if it starts making serious progress on a variety of fronts, then it's very unlikely that Trump would then continue to pull the plug on Ukraine. I mean, so he may threaten not one penny more for Ukraine, but if he suddenly sees Russia is continuing its offensive and Ukraine is collapsing, then I think Trump would probably change his view and say, we can't allow a complete collapse of Ukraine. So that's so there's a lot of different factors in play here, and so but as I say, at the moment, Ukraine Zelensky has played his hand very badly. He has misjudged Trump. He clearly did think that Trump is just another Biden, yet another American political leader. He, who'll kowtow to him, and we stand with Ukraine and all the rest. And most Western political leaders, including American political leaders, have all basically embraced Zelensky. They say, yeah, Zelensky. And distance themselves from the comments that Trump made. I mean, even that Nigel Farage said, "Oh, no, well, no, Zelensky's not a dictator." Not quite sure why Farage wanted to distance himself from Trump. And my Rumble account says Trump will be at the victory day, May the 9th. Well, that would be a very, very interesting development. If I were Trump, I would do it. Because if he goes there on a Victory Day parade on May the 9th, that would be such a boost for Russia. Russia will be in a very difficult position to refuse Trump's entreaties, bring this war to an end. Look, I've come to you, May the 9th. I'm here on May the 9th. This is a big deal for you, and I did it. I did it at political risk for myself, and I did it for you. And I think that I think it'll be a big deal for the Russians, and I think the Russians will just say, all right, well, we have to compromise. Now, if Russia had won this war earlier on, if you had wrapped it up earlier on, we wouldn't be in this situation. But be that as it may, the war was not won, and so now Russia is in the situation that they have to keep in with Trump. They have to then work with Trump, because if they don't, then they're going to feel Trump's wrath. We don't know what Trump would do, but also whoever comes after Trump isn't going to make Trump's gestures. In other words, if they say, "Hey, look, Trump has made all these gestures, and it's still the Russians wouldn't compromise. I'm not going to make the gestures that Trump made. I mean, if it's J.D. Vance, I'm not going to do that." So it's so it's got to be it's a very interesting one. I tend to think that that's probably a bridge too far for Trump to go to Moscow for May the 9th. It's not impossible. Trump's an audacious sort of person, but I think that would be that really would be quite a bold step. So my Rumble account says Trump simply doesn't care about Ukraine one iota. That I think that's true. However, he also doesn't want to preside over a complete NATO debacle. Because if Ukraine collapses and Russia is seen as a obvious victor, then Trump will be presiding over a major humiliation. I don't think he wants to do that. So that's why it's a difficult one. I mean, I think no question he doesn't like Zelensky. He doesn't care about Ukraine. He thinks this was a terrible, stupid war to have fought. Clearly, there was he blames all the Democrats, but also the Republicans for this. But he inherited this war. I mean, not wholly. He contributed his his 2 bits worth in keeping this war going during his first term. But yeah, I mean that's I think as I said the other day, I think Trump has other fish to fry. What this other fish to fry is, I think we're going to get a clear idea in the coming days and months. It could well be that he wants to help Israel completely reorganize the Middle East. I mean, they say, look, they've done pretty well. I think obviously he wants the Palestinians gone from the Gaza. He may well want the Palestinians gone from the West Bank as well. He's probably very happy with what Israel has done to Hezbollah. And so he might think, well, there's only one piece left in the jigsaw, and that's Iran. And that this is the time this is probably the best time of all to take out Iran. And so to take out Iran, he probably wants to make sure Russia doesn't do anything to help Iran. In other words, Russia will not provide air defenses to Iran. Russia will not provide missiles to Iran. In other words, Russia will just maintain a neutrality. And I think that's one. I think maybe one of the reasons why he thinks Trump wants this war brought to an end, so that they can focus on Iran. Look, I mean, I don't think this plan of displacing the Palestinian millions of Palestinians. I don't think you can do it. I don't think it can be done. I mean, it's absolutely insanity to think about doing that. But it's quite possible. There have been all these people, these ideologues writing and saying, well, why not? There've been big population displacements and mutual exchanges of populations over the years, and they more or less settled outstanding problems. So they say, well, look, there was a huge exchange of population between Turkey and Greece in the 1920s. Greeks living in Turkey moved to Greece, and then Turks, moved to Turkey. There was obviously the exchange of populations between the Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus at the time of the Indian partition in 1947. A lot of people were killed, but it did at least kind of stabilize the situation. And of course, there was the Germans after World War II who were kind of driven out pretty much throughout Eastern Europe. I mean, there've been many Germans living in Eastern Europe. They were all driven out and dumped into Germany. And then, of course, you had Poles who were living in Ukraine. They were driven out, dumped into Poland. Again, Germans who lived in Poland but dumped into Germany. These are all terrible things. I mean, there's no question. There's a horrible, horrible events. However, there may well be people around Trump who say to him, well, just bite the bullet and you'll finish the problem once and for all. And then in 100 years' time, historians will write and say, well, basically this was the only solution to the Palestinian problem. That's it. And then, that's brought a measure of stability to the Middle East. So that, I think that's one possibility. Now, there's also clearly the issue of China. Clear that Trump wants to deal with the China problem. China is a competitor. China is a rising power as he sees it, and he obviously thinks that this policy of NATO expansion has driven Russia into the arms of China. I mean that's oversimplified view, but I can see why Trump would think in those terms. So, again, in his view, it's time to wrap it up. It makes no sense to fight against Russia because Russia is basically, on our side. And besides, just Russia just isn't a significant enough player. He doesn't really think now Russia is a huge player in the world. But nonetheless, it's probably useful to have Russia on our side against China, and that the program of degrading, destroying, defeating Russia. Just they just say, well, what's the point of this? Russia just simply isn't that powerful that America needs to waste too much time on it. And I think that is what the conclusion that Trump would come to. Just simply, well, hey, we all thought they would win this war easily. They didn't. Therefore, essentially, we don't need to worry that much about Russia. I mean, but the people who do worry about Russia or claim to worry about Russia, they are all ideologically driven. They're all just airing their historic grievances. But it's not based on any objective assessment of reality. So that's why I think Trump would turn around and say, why are we waging this war against Russia? We should be focused on China. And if we do focus on China, what's important is to ensure that Russia doesn't really provide any assistance to China. And if there is a confrontation with China, I doubt Russia would do much more for China than China did for Russia. China did a little bit. China didn't do very much. So, I think, but I think that's what he would almost certainly go. Well, if we're going to take on China, the last thing we want is Russia providing some kind of military assistance or any kind of economic assistance or whatever. So I think that's probably what Trump is thinking, and he going back to his 2015, 2016, he never believed that America needed to waste its time on Russia. That's why, when he talked about why can't we have good relations with Russia, he did want to improve relations with Russia. He's always been much more focused on China. And I think that, again, it's like if he's going to deal with Iran or he's going to deal with China, and I don't know which one he's going to focus on. But if he is going to do that, he really doesn't want Russia, at least he wants Russian neutrality in either case. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals page. These are the people who keep the dogs, uh, to the life in the life that they are accustomed, so they don't go after me with the customary savagery. That they so that's why these are people I are most important, the Gagglers who are with us. And so Kick567 says, George, do you think it's a good idea to read out the Trumpster's last Truth Social post? It dropped an atom bomb on Zelensky's pissing match and followed up with Elon's musketeer, David Sachs, Tech Bros MAGA gone wild on X, calling out Zelensky for the murder of Gonzalo Lira. Did the Trumpster nail the final nail in Zelensky's proverbial coffin? War? I think it's very interesting. Your question, the Gonzalo Lira case is very illustrative because uh, after all the talk about Alexei Navalny, huge thing. The media have been obsessing over him for years. But no one seemed to care about it with Gonzalo Lira. And since the issue here is that, oh, how dare Trump suggest that Zelensky is a dictator, then you bring up all these other things. Well, he's basically, he consolidated all the media into one kind of state-run entity. He has persecuted the Russian Orthodox Church. He has persecuted his political opponents. I mean, including Poroshenko. I mean, it's frozen Poroshenko's account. And then, of course, he killed Gonzalo Lira. And what was amazing about the episode with Gonzalo Lira is that he was an American. He enjoyed American citizenship, and the Biden administration did nothing for him. Not one thing. They made nothing. They didn't issue any protest. This is the same Biden administration that was so indignant about what was the name? Well, there was obviously the Wall Street Journal reporter, who, after all, was treated reasonably well. He was released, and then, of course, there was the basketball player. Again, she was released. Gonzalo Lira didn't do anything. Gonzalo Lira practiced journalism. There's no case at all that he did. He went in for espionage. It was a reasonable case in that it was that the Wall Street Journal reporter was engaged in espionage. The basketball player had brought in drugs into Russia. Not a good idea. Russians take a very strong view on that sort of thing. But other than the handful of people who raised the issue of Gonzalo Lira, nobody else did. So all this indignation, as I say, including even from Nigel Farage. Well, how come I say anything like that? He's a dictator. I said, well, this is an American citizen, a journalist. He wasn't doing anything. He was just doing podcasting. We had him on the Gaggle a couple of times, and he was killed in prison. And all the people talking about how dare you call into question Ukrainian democracy? How dare you suggest that Ukraine is anything but on the front lines of the fight between democracy and authoritarianism? And I said, well, where were you on the issue of Gonzalo Lira? So I think it's entirely appropriate. There is no free journalism in Ukraine. Zelensky is in the sixth year of his 5-year presidential term, and yeah, it just shows the extent to which the media just absolutely just parrot these talking points. And of course, that's what they say about Trump. Oh, Trump is parroting Putin's talking points, but of course, they're the ones who do it. Zelensky said, "Oh, we can't have elections because it's against the Constitution." Well, you can easily have an election, and in fact, if Zelensky was smart, Zelensky say, "Okay, we will have an election, as long as Russia um, commits itself to a ceasefire, because we can't have an election while we're being shot at. We can commit ourselves to a ceasefire." That would put Russia on the spot. What are they going to go for a ceasefire just so long they can have an election? But everyone just simply repeats it. Oh, we can't have an election because there's a war on. Well, the United States had an election during the Civil War. The United States had an election during World War II, and the United States and the UK, incidentally, they keep talking about how the UK. Oh, the UK didn't have an election. Actually, the UK did have an election because it was still at war with Japan. So in the summer of 1945, the UK had a general election while it was still at war. So of course you can have a war. You can have an election during a war. But either way, I mean, it's just to show people just repeat this unthinkingly and say, well, why can't you have an election just because there's a war on? Of course, you can have an election, but I mean, what they did to Gonzalo Lira, no question. I mean, that doesn't show a great deal of respect for freedom. Anyway, Kick 567, thank you very much for your generosity. And then he says, "Oh, I forgot. The Trumpster is calling Zelensky an unelected dictator. Yeah, and J.D. Vance is telling Zelensky to watch himself. Don't bite the hand that feeds you." Is Zelensky reading Boris Johnson's script? It's very funny that Boris Johnson is trying to obviously engineer some kind of a political comeback by currying favor with Trump. So he's saying, "Oh, you're." I mean, he's the worst. He's the most hawkish, Russophobic character around. But for some reason he's defending Trump. I mean, he's obviously thinks that the way forward for him politically is by identifying himself with Trump. I don't think so. I think he's done. I think his political career is over. But I think it's very interesting. But he obviously does not agree with Trump. But he's saying, well, Europeans need to really absolutely listen to Trump. They have to take so they need to stop freaking out over the things Trump says. So, but you can see how he and Farage is not playing his hand well. So I think I think the key to Farage's success is by being seen as the British Trump. Once he starts distancing himself from Trump, I think politically he's done. Anyway, Marx 2023 says, "George, the Russians would not do what the American NATO regimes did in Iraq, shock and awe, indiscriminate bombing of civilians." Well, you don't have to. No, I don't think you need to bomb civilians indiscriminately. I think that's not a good strategy. You do need to destroy your adversary's military capabilities. So there will be what's there will be some civilian casualties, no question. But so I mean, no one does that. No one just simply bombs civilians. And Americans didn't do that. Of course, there was the collateral damage. There's of course collateral damage when they do it. But what Russia needed to do in 2022 is to knock out the Ukrainian military capabilities before they launch their infantry attack. I mean, that's kind of what you need to do, so that they don't. You're not sending your soldiers right into the line of fire. You don't have to target civilians. So. Um, And Marx 2020 says real GDP, purchasing power, 1 China, 2 America, 3 India, 4 Russia. Well, as I've said before, that's an almost completely meaningless um, statistic, because China and India are just bloody big countries. So if you're a bloody big country, um, you will have an awful lot of economic activity. That doesn't mean anything. You just the GDP, which just simply is a measure of all of the economic sum total of all the economic activity. You got 1.4 billion rather, probably more. Who knows what the population of China or India is? You're going to have a lot of economic activity, but nobody really thinks that India is sort of the number 3 economic power in the world. It's just I mean, it just isn't, obviously. It's just a big country. I mean, we were talking about China last time, and I think I was being a little unfair, or at least I was being a little facetious when I said, "Oh, China just produces all this junk." Um, Electronics, with crappy hair dryers or crappy lamps that work for about 2 days and so on. And I think that's as I say, I was being facetious, and obviously China produces um, a lot more than that. Um, but all of it with China is really questionable. Electric vehicles, where China is clearly has a dominant presence. I mean, I think the jury. It's a kind way of putting it is the jury is still out whether electric vehicles are really the future. I think people don't like them. I'm not at all sure that people are going to go for electric vehicles. They've gone all in for that, but I think now, particularly under the influence of Trump, there's a move, at least, well, either towards hybrid cars or to fossil fuels. It just doesn't have all the problems that come with electric vehicles. So we'll see about that. And again, we'll see about the Belt and Road Initiative, whether that's really a viable project, and whether countries really want to go for it. Whether they want to build, roads to nowhere, and whether they want to run up huge debts. Right? I mean, it was bad enough when you were running up debts to the IMF, and then the bills come due, and you have to then make serious economic sacrifices in order to pay off your creditors. But the same thing will apply in the case of China. China is going to have to, it's lent out a lot of money, and China wants its debts repaid. So I think that there's going to be a wariness on the part of many countries where they really want to go down this path of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, obviously there's more to China than just crappy hair dryers, but neither am I going to buy into the whole the world is going to be owned by China. And again, as I was saying the other day, I'm old enough to remember the hysteria of the 1970s and 80s over Japan. Japan Inc. You couldn't pick up any copy of The Economist, Time Magazine, Newsweek, without having on the cover, can anyone stop Japan? You see the famous Japanese flag flying over New York, and the whole world is going to be taken over by Japan. It was wildly exaggerated, but at least then, the Japanese were, because people didn't pay enough attention to the serious problems that Japan was running into, as is China. But it was just it was absurd to think that somehow the Japan could take over. Japan could somehow take over the American economy. Is this? But there's always the desire and I share it as well. I share the desire that somehow somebody is going to shake and challenge the Western dominance. There's always that thing that somebody will emerge, and I'd like to see that. There's no question. This is what I want. I'd love to see. It was back in the day. It was the Soviet Union was going to. It was a new alternative model that would take on Western capitalism. Then that kind of faded away. Then we had as I say, the German, the Japan thing. The Japan, oh, they got a completely different way of economic organization, the culture, the family, meaty. They're doing things very differently in Japan than anywhere else. So that kind of faded away. And now, of course, we've got the China thing. And again, it would be nice. No question. I mean, we would all like to see Western hegemony challenge. We would all like to see the Western dominance challenge. I mean, the West has been dominating the world for hundreds of years now. I would love to see a challenge, but one also has to be realistic and say, well, maybe we've got to wait a little bit on that. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Not going to happen next week. So, anyway, thanks very much. Then we have. So we have Robert. Good to see you, Robert. Robert says, and don't forget that when the House moved to impeach Trump over the perfect call, Zelensky did nothing to come to Trump's defense in regard to Trump's questioning of the legitimacy of Biden's demand to oust the prosecutor investigating Hunter Biden and Burisma. You're absolutely right, Robert, and that's a very important point, that Zelensky could have done an awful lot more at the time, and I mean, obviously, it was the perfect phone call. And remember, they impeached him not just because of the phone call, but that they somehow Trump was refusing to spend the money Congress had appropriated on arms for Ukraine, and which again, Trump is perfectly constitutionally entitled not to do that. He's the commander in chief, and therefore, if he thinks that this is not in the interest of the United States to pour weapons into Ukraine, which might lead to a world war, then it's entirely within the jurisdiction of the president to make that call. But Zelensky didn't really do anything. Zelensky could have said, "Hey, there was no shortage. The money was coming. There was, there was no stoppage of American money." And Trump continued to send money, but nonetheless, Zelensky allowed the impression to be created that somehow Trump had cut off funding for Ukraine because Zelensky had not played ball on digging up dirt on Biden. That was part of the bill of attainder against Trump. So Zelensky did nothing to help Trump then, and it was no question. I mean, Trump was perfectly within his rights to find out what the hell the Biden family had been up to in Ukraine. We still don't know the full story. I mean, they were there for a number of years, the Biden family and their entourage, who all kind of poured into Ukraine after 2014. You're absolutely right there, Robert. And Marx 2023 says 3 good podcasts. John Helmer on Dialogue Works Monday and Wednesday, and today Glenn Deason with Brian Berletich. Well worth a look. Cuts through the Trump mania and alternative media. And then Trump. Mark says, I see the Trump-Zelensky spat where Trump said that Russia could raze Ukraine to the ground if Putin wanted to. um, so and then Kick 567, Law and King is not the Trumpster. And then Robert says Barnes did a good job explaining the justification for the unitary executive. Yeah, but I think a lot of people have done that. There was this guy at the Center for Renewing America. I always forget his name. He used to work for. He worked for in the Trump Justice Department in the first term, and he was one of the people who was indicted by Forney Willis. But he wrote a very good article on the unitary executive. So you know, so a lot of good work has been done by that. Um, and then Mark says Trump plans a visit to Fort Knox to inspect the 10,000 tons of gold. The question is, will he find the real gold or painted lead? All that shines is not always gold. Should the gold not be there when it's over for the reserve dollar, the final collapse of the Western Empire? Um, anyway, and then Mark says Trump is pure entertainment; it's just show business. Well, I don't know. I think it's more than that. I mean, he's being clearly challenged by the courts. I mean, this is a serious issue where you have judges clearly violating the spirit of the Constitution, whereby they're telling the president what he can and whom he can hire, whom he can fire, whom he's what agencies that he can make decisions on behalf of. I mean, it's nonsensical. I mean, he is the head of the executive branch. The judges, I mean, it's like, oh, the judge decided that they can just simply run the government. It's absolutely ridiculous. But it serves the purpose of of slowing his momentum, because now it's all going to be stuck in the courts for for months. I mean, it's going to wind their way up to the Supreme Court. Then you have to wait for them to rule, and so on. Ivan Grozny, oh, thank you very much for your generosity. I really thank you for that generous tip. And George, hope it's a decent sized tip. Well, to me, it is absolutely first rate. Thank you so much. The dogs, I mean, I can't speak on their behalf. I mean, they just they have their own logic. But thank you. For me, I think thank you for your generosity. I really appreciate that. All the best to you and Peter. Favorite podcast for the past 2 years. Well, thank you so much, Ivan Grozny. I really appreciate it. Thank you again for your generous tip. And then Ivan Grozny says, also, I miss Budapest and Langos. Curious for your best Langos recommendation for Budapest the next time I go. I quite like the retro Langos. To be honest, I'm not a huge Langos person. It's just not. That's never been my my thing. So I'm not someone who can whose recommendations would be particularly useful. Since I don't really eat Langos. I like the sort of the main Hungarian kind of entrees, whether it's goulash or paprikás csirke, or the fish soup, halászlé, or this it's very those hearty Russian Hungarian dishes. Very very strong on the paprika, but that's what I like. To me, they often don't put enough paprika in it because they like they have to worry about the tourists and whatever. Tourists aren't used to paprika, so I always have to ask for additional doses of paprika. And then I kind of like the sort of various stuffed cabbage, stuffed peppers. Those are the things that I really like. So if you were to ask me to recommend restaurants where you can get those very good Hungarian dishes, that I can recommend. But the Langos places are ubiquitous in Budapest, but I don't know which one which to recommend. I also like the sort of the pancake, what they call palacsinta. Was very very tasty. And often I don't even want any stuffing. I can just eat them by themselves. So. kind of got me hungry now talking about this. But anyway, thank you, yeah, Ivan Grozny. Um, and then and the Marx 22 says, George, I heard today that Zelensky should defect to Russia. It's only hope for life on earth for him and his family. In exchange for all the dirt of Western leadership, President Musk has plans to send Zelensky to Mars. And that's a good question. I think where is he safest? I wouldn't think that he'd be particularly safe in Russia, because even if the government wouldn't want to kill him, and they probably wouldn't want, if they were to give him asylum, I don't think they'd want to kill him. They that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be Russians around who are very, very angry about the so much loss of lives. They have family members who lost their lives in Ukraine. So I don't think he'd be safe. I think there'd be somebody or other would recognize him and would just kill him. So I don't think that's a good idea to go to Russia. Assad is a different case. I think Assad, I don't think there's anyone in Russia. The Russians wouldn't allow anyone in who was likely to try to kill Assad. But I don't think Zelensky would be safe in Russia. So, but it's a good question as to where would he be safe? I think probably somewhere, some nice Caribbean island. Enjoy his money. Those are nice places to live. There's worse places in the world, than to live out your remaining days somewhere in the Caribbean. Marty, always good to see you. Thank you so much for your generosity. Always appreciate it. Anne Marie, thank you so much. Really appreciate your generosity. And Anne Marie, always interested in any suggestions for musical pieces that you think we should play, on the Gaggle Music Club. So, please, any suggestions, would be most welcome. And and then Mark says 2023, and again, as Anne Marie, as I said, if you have any musical pieces of your own, to show us, your amazing musical skills, again, please, if you can, post them on our locals board. I think the last time you did that was, it went down very well. Everyone loved that that work that you showed, the one for Julian Assange. It was beautiful music. So thank you for that. And if anything that you can post would be most welcome, most appreciated. So. March 2023, John Helmer claims that the Russian army is fighting with one arm behind its back due to political pressure. Well, I don't know. Whether that's the case or whether they're not properly equipped. I don't think they have the manpower, to be honest, that to really. I mean, they've chosen not to mobilize the country. I think that's so. The people who say, "Oh, well, they've got so much more resources than Ukraine has." Well, that's true. It is a much bigger country than Ukraine, but if you don't mobilize, if you don't, you don't have conscription, then essentially you've got the same number of people out in the field as Ukraine does. So, and it's hard to understand exactly what the Russian military strategy is. They certainly haven't used their air power to any particularly useful effect. I mean, they do these missile attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, but those seem to be completely useless in that there've been no serious blackouts in in Ukraine. So I don't know what the point of these attacks on these energy infrastructure. I mean, presumably, I mean, and they're doing it with drones, and drones, they don't cost that much. But I don't know what the point of these, these attacks is if you don't even have any serious blackouts. So I don't know whether that's um, the reason. And when you say due to political pressure, with what end in view? What would be what's the political pressure? I mean, in other words, what if if they say you need to fight with one hand behind your back, with a view to what? Why would they want to fight with one hand behind their back? I don't understand the logic of that. I mean, I've heard various conspiracies, but I haven't seen any evidence for the conspiracies. The oligarchs. There's a plot. There's a deal between the Russian oligarchs, the Ukrainian oligarchs. I've heard them, but I haven't seen evidence for that. Mark says Farage is a slippery opportunity. He is rather. Absolutely right. And then Robert says a couple of quid put into this week's tribute package. Thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate that. The dogs will appreciate it to the extent that they ever do. I mean, as I said before, they're not known for their gratitude. It's not a concept that's ingrained. It's not part of their DNA. But I've done my best to try to say you really need to say thank you. People are generous. They're putting their hard-earned money. They're giving it to you. You need to say thank you occasionally. But they just they say, well, you would say that. I mean, that's what I would expect from you. So my arguments with them really don't are not successful. And then Robert says, just in a word that the pilot of the Delta plane which flipped over in Toronto was a 26-year-old woman, provoking once again questions as to the relationship between DEI and air safety. I think I saw that earlier. So yeah, very, very, very much so. And of course, that was the case with the which everyone has now absolutely forgotten about, with the helicopter that went smashing into the passenger airliner in DC. Boom, and everyone attacked Trump. DEI, DEI, and then of course we found out, yeah, it was DEI. This was a person who clearly should never have been flying a helicopter. She was a kind of a flunky in the Biden White House, and she really didn't have the experience and the skills needed for something so sophisticated as that. And boom, that was a lot of people lost their lives. NKMRD says Hungary is pretty nice. They pretend they only have paprika and nice lakes for swimming. Is that the New York cafe? I don't know this picture that you have here. I was at the New York cafe a couple of weeks ago. It's very, very nice. That's always a huge line to get in, and it's very nice. Of course, it's ridiculously overpriced. It's you order a cup of coffee and a small slice of cake, and then you think, whoa. That's expensive, but it's the decor is very nice, and you think, oh, this is a bit of the old Budapest, and of course, the Hungarians milk it. It's this is how you entice the tourists. So anyway, Inkemadi says, turns out Mar-a-Lago found a big locality of lithium. Oh, MOL. Is that MOL? Is that found a big locality of lithium in Pusztaföldvár, Orbán Ika coming. Oh, MOL. No, it's MOL is the Hungarian oil company. Okay, yeah. I thought because I saw M and we were talking to Trump, I thought that's MAL, Mar-a-Lago. No, MOL is the big Hungarian oil company. MOL found a big locality of lithium in Pusztaföldvár, Orbán Ika coming. Yeah, that's pretty good. It's one of those interesting things. I don't know how how feasible. I mean, these kinds of lithium mining is a very expensive enterprise. I mean, I don't pretend to be an expert. I mean, a lot of people pretend, suddenly everybody is a geologist. So that's, always interesting. Like, is it doable, uh, given the cost? But that of course raises the question about the lithium that they get trying to extract in in Serbia, and and again, the Serbs are getting almost nothing out of this. This is a huge mining operation. It's a Rio Tinto Zinc. This is an Anglo-Australian company, but the Germans are really behind this project. But I think the Serbs are getting really a very small percentage, 3% or something like that. Um, and I think in comparison, Trump was offering them 50% to Ukrainians. So Trump was actually offering a very, very generously. It was a much better deal that the Ukrainians were getting than the Serbs. Serbs were only getting 3%. But the deal that Trump offered the Ukrainians, and there's all the indignation. My God, what kind of ways that to treat these wonderful Ukrainians, these freedom fighters, but 50%. That's 50% in comparison with the Serbs who got 3%. 50%, I think, is very generous, since the money was going to come from the Americans, and they're offering Ukraine 50%. That's a very good deal. So and then MKRD. I the under the okay. You posted. There's Anne Marie says that I left a comment and posted a piece by Piazzolla. I'm going to take a look at that. I saw your comment about the about Astor Piazzolla. That you obviously didn't think that highly of Villa-Lobos. I understand that. I mean, I I'm in two minds about Villa-Lobos myself. Um, but I didn't see that you posted a piece by Piazzolla. I mean, I'm going to listen to it right now after this podcast. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. And then NKMRD says, here in Germany we have lots of lithium, but it's hard to get at, a lot of trouble, so nobody does it. No, I think that's the point of that. I think it's awfully hard to mine, very, very expensive to do so. I think the Americans also have a lot of the lithium as well, but it's just really difficult to mine, very expensive. In the end, they just decide that it isn't worth the trouble. Anyway, so thank you very much, everybody who has contributed to the kitty. Very, very cold here, and so really appreciate people trying to keep me company in this icy weather. And as I said before, it's not just the icy weather. I should have said this in the introduction. The icy weather, you get punished. On top of the cold weather, you get punished by being presented with a gas bill that is just insane, absolutely insane how much it is. It's the gas bill here when it comes. It's bigger than anything you pay in New York or in London. That's how insane it is. So anyway, that's I was going to say that at the beginning just to set the scene for a kind of how dismal everything is. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody who had joined me. Thank you above all to everybody who contributed to the tip jar. I have to talk to the dogs tomorrow, see what they think. Whether how bad a mood are they in. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody who contributed. We got a few podcasts coming up over the weekend, and then next Monday we do the joint live stream with Peter, and then on Tuesday it's back to my solo. Let's hope things are going to be a little bit more cheerful. I wouldn't count on it. Anyway, see you very soon. Thank you for today. All the best. Good night. Bye bye.